Okay, Lendsey will be monitoring everything to let people in. And I am going to switch over and share my screen to the presentation. So just bear in mind that when we're over here in this presentation mode, it's going to be difficult for me to monitor the chat box. But really that's what this afternoon's session is going to be for, is the open communication, sharing best practices amongst each other as we start thinking about overview and certification processes. So today will be a lot of Lendsey and I kind of talking at you. If we do have time towards the end, it's going to be a quick 45 minutes. If we do have time towards the end, we'll allow for some questions or in sharing some thoughts. Otherwise, we will use the 45 minutes this afternoon for more of that type of discussion and allowing a lot of your fellow FARs and anybody, other administrators, to share your thoughts on how you're preparing for certification, specifically to share their thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead and start rolling into the presentation. So today we have myself, Brenda White, Director of Legislative Services, my colleague Lendsey Thomson, Manager of Legislative Services, and Mr. Tony Bybee. He's also here as Director of Technology, and we'll kind of answer any questions about ECP process as we roll through it. Okay, today we're going to talk about kind of a recap of all COVID exceptions as best we can, guidelines for certification, and how will this work in ECP, and restrictions within ECP. So let me go over to our handouts. I'll reshare here in a second to get to our COVID exceptions. Okay. Okay, so just kind of where we're at now with our COVID exceptions, and I'll run through these. You know, this all started March 2020. I think a lot of people even think about March 12th or March 13th. I've heard that quite a bit. It was like D-Day for us when things really changed and things were shut down. So going from March, we pulled our leadership together, COP, NEC, and CFAR on a very regular basis. And we discussed what can we do to allow our freshmen, or sorry, the student athletes that were affected, the spring student athletes that were affected at the time with COVID, what can we do to help them maintain a season that they practically lost? So at the time, there was approval for the 2020 spring sports student athletes. Their term of attendance will not count against them. And they were not charged a season of competition for spring sport athletes only. Going into this past academic year, freshman students were allowed to be eligible immediately if they graduated from high school the spring of 2020. They were not required to have ACT or SAT testing, and they were able to become eligible immediately with a 2.0 cumulative high school GPA. That fall 2020 term again was treated as a not counting towards the total 10 semesters or 15 quarters. And current and prospective athletes were not charged a season of competition for non-intercollegiate play for the window of May 16th, 2020 through May 15th, 2021. Also, that's opening up for the previous outside competitive experience for spring sports athletes even the year before that. Fall sports seniors, student athletes who graduated in December were able to compete this past spring with just enrolling in at least 1 credit hour this spring. And also extended the exceptions at the time. We moved from just fall 2020 not counting to the entire academic year of all semester and quarters, not counting towards the total limits of 10 semesters, 15 quarters. We, at the time, approved the continuation of 20 to 21 requirements of high school GPA. We have now moved into 21-22 academic year. So only student athletes that have graduated during this time period We are specific to students who graduated high school in spring of 2020 and now spring of 2021 to utilize the exception of a 2.0 high school GPA and not be required to have test scores, because the thinking for those outside of that window, so prior to spring of 2020, they had the ability to receive the ability to take an ACT or SAT or even have a class rank. So essentially their time frame was not affected, and so they are required to have the traditional 2 out of 3. And then homeschool students as well were able to get an exception to automatically be eligible if they pass 9 or more institutional credit hours with a grade C or better. Next piece here, some quick hits as we're moving forward. We have the who, what, when, where, and what avenue of looking at things. This breaks down what I just discussed into a little bit more of a drop-down menu to kind of think through which group of students are affected in what manner. And this also for spring sport athletes in spring of 2021. So I will now transition back to our PowerPoints. Again, you guys have this in your handouts to review and think through. So let me change to our presentation. Okay. So we reviewed the handout. Going into part 2. This is where we'll start talking a lot of the questions that we received from all the exceptions that have passed, things that both Lendsey and I have been hitting on for quite some time in our phone calls and emails. So a quick point on participation versus being charged a season of competition. And this comes up a lot with especially transfer students when they're asking about residency. We're not being charged a season of competition, but what does that mean? And also just participation for other exceptions that are out there, specifically like the 24-36-hour rule that we'll talk about here in a second. So in our bylaws, we do actually define participation as just competing in any type of contest, a scrimmage, exhibition, or game. Now, there is an exception to after you participate, and that's the exception of being charged a season of competition. So the first thing first, participation is the act of competing in a game, and the result of that is being charged a season of competition or not being charged a season of competition. So 1 is the act, 2 is the outcome. It's important to think about that as these different questions of, well, is the student held to the transfer residency requirement because they were not charged a season of competition? They will be held to transfer residency as an example because they did participate. Okay. Freshman initial eligibility FAQs. We had questions, and I'll roll through some of these. So my student athlete's decision was issued with just a 2.0 high school GPA. But I also have a qualifying test score. Should a student request an updated decision through the Eligibility Center? And so right now, the Eligibility Center has a process in place to issue an eligible decision of a 2.0, based off 2.0 high school GPA. But if you do not want the student to have to worry about meeting the 2.0 cumulative college GPA after 2 semesters, 3 quarters, then the student will need to manually request an updated decision and make sure that the Eligibility Center has the test score or class rank, what have you, on file so that they can update this decision. What if an athlete was certified as eligible based off a 2.0 high school GPA but will not meet the 2.0 cumulative GPA after 2 semesters or 3/4 terms of attendance? Can the athlete add a qualifying test score to not have to meet that collegiate GPA? The answer to that is it will depend on whether the athlete competed. If the athlete has not competed at all, and again, we're going back to that participation piece. So if the athlete did not participate at all during this 2021 academic year, they have not essentially opted in to the exception yet. So they can request an updated decision and have their eligibility determined based off of updated test scores, class rate, et cetera, so to not be held to that 2.0 cumulative GPA. But if they competed, they're locked into that exception because they opted in to that 2.0 high school GPA COVID freshman exception, and they'll have to stay with that and utilize that. Freshman initial eligibility, another question we get, a student athlete received an EC decision with just a 2.0 high school GPA, but the student did not participate in any intercollegiate contest during the 2021 academic year. Are they required to meet the 2.0 cumulative GPA? So the answer is no. Again, going back to that point I just brought up, the student did not opt in to using the COVID exception. They can be certified as normal for the 24-36-hour rule without the need to meet the cumulative GPA. We'll talk about the 24-36-hour rule exceptions here in a few slides, but this is going to be important to star and highlight and identify, and as we talk about best practices later, kind of having a roster sheet of student athletes that received a decision based off the 2.0 high school GPA and whether they competed or participated this past year based off that exception. Because if they did not meet the other exception, the other requirement of a 2.0 cumulative GPA after 2 semesters with 3/4 terms of attendance, but they did not compete, they're not held to that COVID exception. They're not held because they did not opt in. So they can be certified as normal based off meeting the 24-36-hour rule. And if they've only completed 2 semesters or 3/4 terms of attendance at this time, they're not required to meet a GPA requirement. Okay. Here's a little bit of a quick boxes here of the seasons, what to expect here for seasons of competition. So this is specific to students who have completed 2 semesters or 3/4. Are they charged a season of competition? Again, spring sport athletes this year, as opposed to spring of 2020, they still have the opportunity of being charged a season of competition if they competed in more of the 50% of the frequency of play limits and or if they competed in postseason. The frequency of play limits is going to be specific to what's written in the bylaws per this sport. And so it's not necessarily what the school had scheduled. It's going to be 50% of the frequency of play limits that's listed in Article 1, Section G. The 2.0 collegiate GPA, again, is it required? Yes, if they participated. It's not required if student did not participate. 24-36-hour rule, if they competed, it's required per normal. If they did not compete, here are the options. We'll talk about some of the options here in a second. So I will stop here before we get into 24-36-hour rule. Lendsey, anything in the chat that we need to address?
I don't believe so. Got some questions about the handouts and some questions about the term of attendance, but we're going to get into that here later on in this afternoon. So I did correct the link. The second link that I put in there is a correct link to the handout, so I apologize for that.
Thank you.
And Erin says she has a question that she's typing out, so maybe we can hold on a second.
Sure, yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask it? Is that easier?
Yeah, jump on. How are you?
Okay. So with the freshman exception, let's say we have a freshman this year who qualified using the 2.0 GPA exception, participated. In fall 2021, the GPA is a 1.9. The student cannot play. What if in spring 2022, the GPA is a 2.1?
Good, yep. And I think I have this here in a slide here coming pretty soon. But you're right. So student athletes that their sport spans multiple terms. Just like you have the ability to recertify after each academic term, they have the ability to gain or lose their ability to continue competing. So they have the ability to gain their eligibility back for the next academic term. If they increase their GPA, they'll be certified to compete. Okay. Lendsey is going to continue to monitor that. I'm going to run it into the 24-36-hour rule. So this has been, as students in their final grades have come through, this has been a very high level questions that we've received in the past few weeks concerning the 24-36-hour rule, and then specifically to exception 3, which I have included here in the slide. So everybody knows the 24-36-hour rule, you have to pass 24 hours in the previous 2 semesters or 36 hours in the previous 3 quarter terms of attendance. If there is a combination of just like 1 quarter and 1 semester, then the student needs to meet 24 hours in those combined terms. Exception 3 speaks to a student who does not meet the 24-36-hour rule. And I think the reason why we're getting this question again goes back to that question of, well, did the athlete participate and were they charged a season of competition? So the question is, a student can receive an exception to the 24-36-hour rule if they never competed this past year, if they never participated. It's not so much whether they're not charged. Again, that's separate. That's just the outcome. But if they never competed or never participated this past year, their first time intercollegiate competing, they can receive an exception to the 24-36-hour rule. So the exception is, especially for these students getting the COVID, if they wish to utilize the COVID exception at a 2.0 high school GPA to receive an exception to the 24-36-hour rule. So let's walk this out a little bit in some drop-down questions. So the question is, so certifying a student after 2 semesters or 3 quarters. And I've added here, for the purpose of this scenario, the students graduated high school again in spring of 2020 and identified continuously between 20 and 21. And for those that are new, identification means that they were enrolled in at least 12 institutional credit hours in fall and spring, and or competed identifies the student at the institution. So we're looking at students who were continuously identified in 2021, and they were spring 2020 high school graduates. Sorry, go back. Okay, so did the student athlete compete in 2021? Yes, we're gonna apply the 24-36-hour rule as normal. No, you apply the 24-36-hour rule as stated in the bylaws, and then you ask the question, if the student athlete did not meet the 24-36-hour rule, can exception 3 be used? Again, since they did not compete, which a lot of student athletes did not this past year, they have the option of looking at utilizing 2 different options. Option 1, use the traditional 2 out of 3 freshman eligibility requirements to meet exception 3. So that would be the 2.0 high school GPA in combination with a class rank or qualifying test score. Option 2 could be that the student uses the COVID freshman exception, the 2.0 high school GPA. However, they will be required to meet the 2.0 collegiate GPA after 2 semesters or 3 quarters. So we're allowing the student to utilize the 2.0 high school GPA, the COVID freshman exception, to meet exception 3 of the 24-36-hour rule, but they cannot get one without the other. They'll be required to meet the 2.0 collegiate GPA. So I briefly saw that Ed Loeb raised his hand, and I'll stop right there. Ed, if you have your question.
Yeah, I just want to sort of get your take on the idea that the way this exception seems to be written, and I'll take some of the blame on this because I was with you part of writing this. It seems to indicate that these freshmen that use the COVID exception need to have a 2.0 basically starting this semester and moving forward through their entire career. Is that correct?
So, I'm sorry. So say that one more time. You're a little bit light there.
Sorry. So based on the way the exception seems to be written and the way it's presented.
And the COVID freshman exception?
Yes, the COVID freshman exception. If they use that exception, basically starting this next year for the ones from 2020, they need to have a 2.0 GPA or better in their college career in order to be eligible, basically now moving forward. Regardless of whether they're a sophomore, they have to have a 2.0 to be eligible moving forward. Is that correct?
Yes, so at any point in time that the student is certified to compete after their second semester or third quarter terms of attendance, they're now kind of locked in to that 2.0 cumulative GPA. So to Aaron's question, if the student doesn't meet it in the fall, or even if the student's not certified and they're actually a spring sport, so we really don't care what it looks like in the fall, they have the ability to be certified mid-year and have the ability to meet that 2.0 cumulative GPA. Questions? I see a lot of things coming through in the chat.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of questions here. So some people, let's look through here real quick. I mean, I think you've
Okay.
answered most of
Yeah.
them, and I'm answering them as I'm going through. So
We're going to talk about flagging here in a second, flagging those that have a 2.0. It's not going to be positive news, unfortunately, so we'll talk here in a second about that. Lindsay's talked with Alexandria and got some others, Dale, okay?
yeah, I think
So we're all caught up. I'm going to continue pushing on here with the questions. Okay, so next slide here, we have kind of a similar process. We're going to look at, was the student athlete certified under the freshman COVID exception? The question is, were they certified? Then yes, but did the student athlete earn a 2.0 cumulative GPA after the second semester? Going to our points here that we talked about previously, if no, the student is ineligible for that academic term that they wish to be certified, but as I put here in the note, understand that the student has the ability to gain eligibility after the term to be recertified. If the student has earned a 2.0 cumulative GPA, yes. Did the student compete this past year? No. So if there's a concern for the 24-36 hour rule, we'll look at exception 3 options listed in the previous slide. Otherwise, apply the 24-36 hour rule as stated in the bylaws. So that's a lot there. I know for the 24-36 hour rule. If there's anybody who wishes to raise their hand and ask a question, we can take a couple. Otherwise, we'll move into certifying an ECP. I don't think I'm seeing any, unless you want to unmute.
one thing I will say, I'm getting ready to reply to Victor. I've had a couple of requests for the PowerPoint, specifically so you can share it with your coaches or use it for whatever training. We'll upload this to the legislative page at NAIA.org like we do each year after convention. So you guys will have it there and you guys can pull it right down from that legislative page.
It was added as an attachment to this session as well. So since I imagine each one of you have clicked to join this session through the through the convention platform, underneath our pictures to join, there are the handouts. Also, I've added the handouts to the afternoon session as well for those who are not able to make it in the afternoon, so they have a reference to what we're looking at today. And so then we will, like Lendsey said, post it online to share with a lot of people. We want to make sure, and we'll talk about this in a second, that this information is passed along to a lot of people over the summer to prepare.
One other question we just got from Alexandra was, will the COVID freshman exception be listed in their profile on PlayAI? That is a yes. That will be in their decision. It's a custom note on their decision on PlayAI. So you should be able to see exactly who got that COVID exception.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how this might look in ECP. So now we're thinking about, okay, we're going to prepare to certify going into the fall. You all are starting to think about and percolating all this information. And I was just on another session with the ADA, the Athletic Directors Association, and I really emphasized with them and like, guys, this certification is going to be a bear coming fall. I don't want us to start thinking about this on July 30th. That's why we're going to hit you with a lot of education this summer, webinars, handouts, anything that we can provide you all. And part of this is going to be this presentation here, but it's going to take some time to kind of start gathering some information. So I threw out some ideas I know that will be needed to prepare to certify this coming academic year so that you feel confident when you sit down and start entering information in, that you're not jumping back and forth or having to pull people in and ask questions, and you just you feel a little bit more organized and ready to go. So the first thing I put in was a roster of the athletes who participated during the 2021 academic year. You can check for transfer student athletes who identified at a previous NAIA institution. Did they compete? Do they need an updated EC decision? So remember, if they did not compete, they received an EC decision last year, but did not compete in transfer, they will need an updated eligibility center decision. They'll need to request an updated decision. So pull that situational analysis out and get familiar with that to see who will need an updated decision. Review EC decisions who were given a decision under the COVID freshman exception. I think I have this here on the next slide, but I'll go ahead and talk about it. Well, actually, I'll wait here in the next slide or two. So manually mark those who need a 2.0 cumulative GPA. Note who were the spring sport athletes during spring of 2020. They will have a different term of attendance than their fall or winter sport counterparts. And what else do you find useful? So start thinking about that. I did have a question in ADA, and they said, well, it'd be great to have like a kind of a flow chart, a check sheet that we can start checking off. So I'm happy to start working on that over the summer to say, okay, here's what we have at least right now that we know is useful, and let's start looking at a check sheet as you start preparing for certification. So restrictions between the ECP and PlayAI, and this goes to a gazillion and one questions. If I get a penny for every time this question was asked, I'd be able to leave and retire and not be here today. So unfortunately, there is not a way in ECP for it to automatically flag who received the COVID freshman exception. That's because the ECP technology and the PlayAI technology can only communicate so much, and they communicate basically on one strand. They can pull the student's EC decision. So ECP will be able to see that the student athlete is eligible. But this goes back to when we've had plenty of violations in the past of a student who needed an updated decision through the situational analysis. It does not tell you the points, the drop-down points under that student's EC decision. It just says the student received an eligible decision. So you'll need to look at that student's EC decision to say, okay, well, did they receive a decision under the COVID freshman exception? Did they receive a decision of eligible but never competed, and then they transferred and they need an updated decision? So those are the kind of things that in the past you still needed to have kind of at your fingertips to understand what the student's decision entailed. There's also information in the student's PlayAI profile about amateurism flags and other things. So the ECP system was never meant to be your one-stop shop and never look at the student's PlayAI profile. It's always been a requirement that you have a little bit more information. So unfortunately, there's not much more we can do to have a more detailed automatic flag between PlayAI and ECP to show if a student has a 2.0 or high school GPA only.
So one question we just got, just a clarification, was a spring sport athlete who is subject to the 2.0 GPA, and I think that you answered this earlier, but I might have missed it. I was
Sure.
going through this, but a spring sport athlete could gain eligibility heading into the spring of 2022 by raising their GPA, correct?
Exactly. So again, remember, anytime an academic term approaches and you're still certifying that sport again for the next academic term, a student has the ability to either lose their eligibility or gain eligibility. That's the same thing for the 24-36 hour rule and everything else. So a student has the ability to regain if they do not have their 2.0 cumulative GPA immediately after. So this slide here, I just mimicked it, talked about the restrictions between ECP and PlayAI, that we will not be able to have a COVID checkbox of those for the mere fact that you're still having to manually check anyway. So it does not make sense to program in a COVID checkbox that notes a student must have a clean GPA of 2.0. What we are looking at, though, is one change, and we'll communicate this down the road when we get with the programmers, is to have an open text box that recycles each term. And it's a way for everybody to make certain notes. So it could be anything. It could be a COVID freshman exception. It could be a spring sport athlete. It could be the student needs to register for graduate school. And so we're gonna have an open text box, and that's our wish, is to have an open text box within each student's profile. So they have the ability to make notes and that it recycles into the next term in which you're certifying the student athlete. So you have a history. So we're looking into that a little bit more information to come, but that would be, I think, a helpful thing instead of just a quick COVID checkbox, that you have an open text box to add those notes. We get questions on how do we know if there's a winter, spring, or fall sports, and we go by the traditional championship season to determine if they're a fall, winter, or spring championship sport. So here's the list here.
I will say also on that, if you go to the NAIA.org, there's the sports section. If you just hover over that, it tells you each sport in each season. So I know it's kind of hard to keep track of. The only ones that you got to be kind of aware of are some of the invitational sports are listed just under invitational and not under the specific season. But last time I checked, they all match up gender-wise, so it should be the same.
Okay. So now we're getting into more certification pieces. Important ECP technology note to this: the term of attendance exceptions, especially for students that were multiple sport athletes, both spring and then fall and winter. The program will not allow for the student's window to have multiple terms of attendance. So our advice has been to create different profiles for different students, because if you have in one box, and we'll show you here in a second, if you have one box and you click unlock, I want to change a outdoor track and field athlete's term of attendance, and now I'm certifying for cross country in the fall. I want to change their terms of attendance. It will change the term of attendance across all sports under one student athlete's window. So our advice has been for a workaround is to create two separate profiles. So it could be Brenda outdoor track and field and Brenda cross country, two sports I've never played. But if you can have those two profiles and have the different terms of attendance saved for each student athlete. Tony, you shouldn't have laughed so easily on that. I haven't ran past 90 feet on a basketball court, so. Okay, how to certify terms of attendance, an example, and this is specific to semesters, so I'm sorry, you quarter term of attendance folks, I can update that as well. Here's an example, and this has been in our ECP handout that we've had online in the COVID page, and we'll continue to update this, but here's an example. So you have your term of attendance at 7 for this, I think this example right here, you're certifying for fall of 2020 for women's cross country. 7, because she completed, including fall of 2020 was at 7 terms of attendance. Currently enrolled for fall 2020 and 15, 9 hours, and then 15 for fall 2019. Rolling this over for spring of 2021, we're freezing, and this has been our advice, so I'll talk about this in a second, freezing that top number at 7. Moving forward, the institutional credit hours enrolled this term can change according to spring of 2021. Updating the hours earned as normal, so you would still reflect what the student earned in fall of 2020 and spring of 2020, spring of 2020 in this example. And again, the cumulative terms of attendance is not changing, but everything else underneath that, the 24, 36-hour rule still needs to be updated accordingly. So we have the women's cross country example, and then we have a women's outdoor track and field example because her terms of attendance was not charged in spring of 2020. So her terms of attendance will be different, but the cumulative hours for each term should still stay the same. So we talk about this frozen aspect. So we get quite a few examples, and I know you guys have gone through this and said, no, we chosen not to freeze that top term of attendance, and instead we want to certify each student with their actual term of attendance. Is this wrong, or are we in a violation? And by no means is this a violation. We don't want this to be something that if it totally does not work with you, that is fine. At the time, that was our best option. And of course, we were learning as we went as well as we're providing advice in ways that we're communicating with our membership to say, okay, well, your term of attendance is frozen, so don't change it. If you wish to go ahead and change it, that's totally fine and keep up. And that is very purposeful, I think, for a lot of registrars and those that were looking at students' progression to keep it as is. But just know that once that student gets to their 10th term of attendance as a semester or 15th quarter, the system is not going to allow for the student to accumulate terms on top of that. So you will eventually have to repeat that term if it comes to it. But I do know also that when it comes to that time, students might not be taking advantage of that extra year. So you may not see that anyway. So just progressing as normal, as accumulating terms, if you wish to move it that way, totally fine. Up to you how you wish to do that.
Brenda, I was gonna jump in there real
Yeah.
quick. Got a couple questions about the text box that you mentioned, and if that, so Clayton Bissett says, when you mention that the text box will recycle, does that mean that the info will be copied and pasted automatically into the following terms text box, or that the text box for the following term will be blank and need to be updated? Tony?
So I'll
The
say
potential text box, I
Yeah.
guess, that we haven't created yet.
exactly.
Talking about.
I'll re-emphasize that. It's a potential text box. Tony and I had a brief conversation like maybe 48 hours ago of what we would like to see on it. Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, but the term of attendance does, so you like when you're certifying and you're rolling the student over to the next term, it does show what the accumulation term of attendance was this past certification
Yes, but
time.
when you add the new term, then it keeps the terms of attendance as it was. It doesn't add any to it, obviously. Now, the text box that we're talking about, I think we would actually have use the comments box that is already there. In a perfect world, what we'd like to do is when you add a comment to it, it would actually display the comment without having to click the box. So that way, just looking at the student record, you'd see the comments that are in there. And it would be at the bottom on that screen, be just above where the comment box is today, the comment button. So it would, I think the plan would be for it to keep those comments intact from term to term. Of course, if you add the new term and you don't want the comment or you want to update the comment, then you could certainly do that, and it would not change the comment as it was in the previous term if somebody was to go back and look. Another option that we're looking at to have the programmers do is to have a checkbox that would potentially allow you to display that comment onto the certificate, much like you do when you force eligible. If you force eligible someone now, the comments that you put in that box show up underneath that student on the certificate. We're proposing, it's somewhat difficult to do it, but I'd like to see us be able to do it where we could check that box and the comments that you put in the general comment box will display. If you don't check the box, they would not display.
So Tony, one of the questions that they've got, and I think I know the answer to this because I think you just answered it, but if they put stuff in the comment box now, that's not carrying over to the next term as it stands now.
I believe that's correct. I actually have not verified that, but I believe that's correct.
Yeah, so we're still, this is all still in early development, being early that it's in, Tony, in my head of what we'd like to see. And we're taking down these comments and questions about how we can recycle things moving forward into the next certification period. So more information to come definitely over the summer. But yeah.
And we certainly realize that ECP, it would be more helpful to have additional programming done to accommodate some of this crazy COVID stuff. But I think the system, of course, we've been using the same system since '07, and we are looking to make some changes potentially in the next couple of years that would actually put it on the same platform and be able to communicate better with the eligibility center system. So I think it potentially gives us an opportunity to be able to share more information between those two systems.
So to Steve Waldeck's comment about we're adding comments right now as it's listed in the ECB text box. And we're hoping that this will carry over. So we'll work with the programmers to make sure that it can. Otherwise, we might have to look at copying and pasting and see what we can do to move it forward.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go back and minimize this chat box and let Lendsey take over again on the chat. Other ECP restrictions that we talked about this past year, especially if you are in that practice of freezing terms of attendance. So understand if you're freezing the term of attendance at 1 for the following term, that's not going to help students who need to meet the 9-hour rule. ECP will not know that the student needs to meet the 9-hour rule because the ECP checks that for every student who's in their second term of attendance. That's where that 9-hour rule is automatically flagged. It's not going to know that if the term of attendance is frozen at 1. So we may not see that as much, but if any athlete, their first identification was this past spring, as you're moving into certification for the fall, and if you choose to repeat number 1 again, understand they will not automatically flag the 9-hour rule, so you'll need to have that ready to go. The 24-36-hour rule is very similar. Here's the example of a student who's in their second term of attendance. So this would look like, again, to that example of a student who just identified for the first time this past fall and spring. If you're repeating that number, but the ECP does not understand that the student who is only in their second term, technically under this example, who is not already completed 2 terms of attendance going into their third for a semester example, the program will not automatically flag that. So you'll need to remember to look at these boxes for students who've actually completed 2 semesters or 3/4 terms of attendance to look at their earned hours and understand that they're not eligible. Other hot topics that we didn't have time to cover today, but we are looking at discussing, so I'll try to quickly touch base on that. Graduate student certification, identification again. A lot of students now are trying to take advantage of graduate school, especially with the additional terms of attendance that they get to use. So we allow for students to be identified in their graduate program based on the full-time enrollment of that program that the institution is determined to be full-time. So we will honor 6 credits if that's their full-time load. We will honor 9 credits if that's their full-time load. We honor what is full-time. And then the 24-36-hour rule is prorated based off of their full-time load. And so there's a certification piece for that. Transfer students, again, residency. We've got a lot of questions about students who are transferring and they completed their bachelor's at one institution and they want to transfer. They must pursue a graduate program of some sort at the next institution if they've completed their bachelor's at their first institution. So that was a lot of questions on that this year. Pretty much not looking at the bylaws because that's pretty clear in the bylaws. And again, if they participated at the previous institution, regardless if they're charged a season of competition, if they competed, they're held to the residency requirement unless they have a release. Another thing was we had a lot of questions on, well, I've graduated, but I want to pursue a minor only. The bylaws require that you must be enrolled in at least a bachelor's program or a graduate program if you're a transfer, and in order to be determined eligible, in order to be certified as eligible. So if the student really wishes to pursue a minor, then and they're continuing on at their institution, then they should not confer their bachelor's degree and just try to roll the minor in under that bachelor's degree if possible. Otherwise, they would need to enroll and be certified under another bachelor's program. So I included the link there for the continuing eligibility COVID FAQ page. And we will certainly be adding a lot more educational materials, like I said, webinars, other updates over the summer. So start thinking about how you're absorbing this, how you wish to certify your athletes with all the exceptions and keeping track of that. This afternoon at 2:00 Central Time, our second session, I'm going to start asking a lot of our fellow faculty athletic representatives from CFAR, our other leadership, and NEC, our kind of seasoned veterans who've gone through this a lot and have thought about this, what they're thinking of their best practices and how they think they should do to keep track of things. So before we go, we're at our 45 minutes now, that if we have a couple more questions, we can try to work that in real quick.
I did want to say one thing, because we've been getting a lot of questions on this, not necessarily from FARs or compliance personnel, but from coaches and athletic directors. You know, we're going to continue to apply our terms of attendance rules, and that includes these exceptions. So students that are at non-NAIA institutions, whether they're athletes or not, were not charged terms of attendance this past year. And we're charged terms of attendance not towards the total, though, this past year. And then seasons of competition, we're going to continue to take previous seasons of competition charged by other athletic associations at face value. So if they were someplace that did charge seasons this past year, they're going to be charged as they come into the NAIA. So just something to keep in mind. I know that that's probably old hat for a lot of you, but just want to reiterate it because that's a question we've been getting a lot. Have had some questions about some of the effective dates. So the second season 2.0 collegiate GPA would go into effect next year, so not this coming year, but the year after. The post-baccalaureate certificate program would go into effect immediately. Tomorrow, if it's passed, it would go into effect for this upcoming year. All the effective dates are at the bottom of the legislative proposals on the website. So if you scroll down, some of them are a little kind of confusing because you got to kind of word them in a way for the eligibility center to apply their decisions, but they're all down there. And then, yeah, coming back this afternoon. So let us know if you got any other questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you hopefully at 2 o'clock with more information on this. If you have any questions, our contact information is below. Lendsey and I are pretty much here in the conference room, so we may not hit our hotline information right away. I gave my direct line. Oh no. That's my direct line. That's not the hotline. Anyway, and legislative@nai.org. So we will be ready to go. Thank you all for your support in this and appreciate all this positive. It's been a good session comments. We really appreciate that. All right, take care.